again, everybody. Lance Russell and Dave Brown right along ringside. By golly, we're about ready to go with more big action.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm Gordon Solie, your host, and we have quite an hour in store for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Championship Wrestling at ringside. This is Vince McMahon, along with wrestling's only living legend, Bruno Sammartino.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mid-South Wrestling Television. I'm your host, Boyd Pierce, another outstanding card.
Hey, guys, and welcome back to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. I am Ray Russell, and this week we dive back into the Tennessee territory, or is it now territories, of 1977, talking just a little bit more about that Jarrett and Gulas split. And we had so much fun with the first episode, got a lot of great feedback. Gonna bring him back onto the show right now, the man with the plan, Mr. Research himself. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the show, Mr. Steve Crawford.
Hey, I'm so excited to be back. So excited about this project. It's been so much fun.
It is. Just your research, just reading it and going back through and looking up what I could find on my end as well. And I did find something, so I hope I made you proud, Steve. We'll get to that in a little bit.
You always made me proud, Ray. You always made me proud.
If there's one thing I do, it's research. I do the best I can anyway, right? So
absolutely.
That's the minuscule things like who are the random people that appear on the end of the Jerry Lawler show every week. So
Exactly. Well, that's why you're one of the best in the business.
So last time we left off, we covered a lot of ground in short fashion. We did a little backstory in regards to the setup for the split that we're going to be talking about here in 1977. Jerry Jarrett gets into booking, eventually gets into promoting for Roy Welch and Nick Gulas, of course, because they are co-promoters. And Jarrett gets the book over in Western Tennessee. And while he's there, he figures, why not add to it? So he adds Evansville, Louisville, even he had those towns, I believe you said, put into his name, the operations put into his name, Jerry Jarrett. So he thinks he's going to go make some major profits alongside his mom. But then Nick Gulas, he wants him a cut and even has to give 5% to Dick the Bruiser in Evansville just to keep him happy.
Right. So what he thought was going to be kind of a 50-50 split between himself and his mom becomes this much watered down split. I'm sure that kind of stuck in his craw for a number of years before he decided to. Yes.
Yeah, it was always sitting there. I go from thinking I'm getting 50% of the gate to 25%, and here's this guy who did nothing over here getting close to 50%. It's insane. But that was the way the old Rasslin territories ran, I suppose. And you wonder why there were outlaws, right? But so Jerry Jarrett, essentially mentored by Roy Welch, who was a co-promoter with Nick Gulas, as I mentioned. Lots of stories about why and how. You brought them all up last time out, why Jerry split away or wanted to split away from the Gulas promotion, going out on his own here to run quote-unquote opposition. Now, some say he stole the territory right out from underneath Welch, but we also looked at the Jarrett version where he said he thought he bought in as a co-owner of the promotion, but he was told by Nick Gulas that he only bought an option to buy in, and Jarrett actually owned nothing.
And I do want to reiterate how consistent Jarrett was with that story throughout his life.
Right.
I mean, not only did he write about that in his book that he did with Mark James, but I also asked him directly about the split at the Cauliflower Alley Club a few years ago, and he told the exact same story. So I think there's probably more than a kernel of truth in that when for decades, this is how you remember something happening.
And let's not forget how Jerry Jarrett found out he didn't own a piece of the pie. He came complaining, I don't want to book George Gulas in my towns, damn it. And he was told, you don't really have an option because you don't own anything. So it all goes back to George Gulas, or at least, that's part of the folklore anyway. So
yeah, we'll be discussing George a lot more in this episode. That's for sure.
Oh, goody. I can't wait.
Yes.
So eventually Roy Welch falls ill. And he's actually going to pass away later here in 1977. So safe to say, Nick Gulas is going to be handling the operations day to day. And for as much as Jerry Jarrett seemed to admire Roy Welch, he equally seemed to loathe Nick Gulas.
Yeah, I think there was definitely a good cop, bad cop in the relationship between Welch and Gulas. And I think Gulas loved being the bad cop guy. And because of Roy Welch's health, he actually left being an active member of the promotion in late 1976 and then you get to mid-February, and then Jarrett resigned. So it did not take very long at all for Jarrett to split off with Nick after Roy left.
So Nick had all of these towns, and then Jarrett over here with Evansville, Louisville. Of course, he's going to take over Memphis. You talked about Lexington, Jonesboro, Tupelo, Blytheville. Eventually, he's going to pick up Jackson, Tennessee as well, because not really far from Memphis. And so Nick Gulas thinks, well, I'm going to go over here to my good buddies at the NWA and get some help. And they say, well, Nick, whatever will be, will be. They don't really want to get their hands dirty in this whole mess. Apparently, the NWA not big fans of Nick Gulas.
Right. They did not treat Jarrett like an outlaw promotion like they did, in Georgia with Ann Gunkel and in other cases in the history of the NWA. They just said, hey, we're going to stay out of this.
Do you think a little bit of that had to do with the fact that Jarrett had ends with the Welch family in regards to he was mentored by Roy Welch, but also he let Buddy Fuller initially buy in a few percent as well. And of course, the Fuller and Welch family were big proponents. They were promoters for the longest time in the NWA.
Right. And I'll get to a quote later where Jarrett specifically says he brought Buddy Fuller on for political reasons, those reasons. So he could smooth things out with the NWA. He didn't really need Buddy as a partner in terms of running the promotion, but he needed his stature in the wrestling world to make sure that he wasn't being viewed as an outlaw.
Well, there you go. Politics indeed. So we talked a lot about the talent that was going back and forth here in both sides, one side or the other. Of course, Jerry Lawler, the Russian Stomper. Of course, Yukon Pierre, the Lumberjacks, and the WWF, Zaranov LeBeau, a couple of his other gimmicks. But the Mongolian Stomper, Archie Goldie, was also here at the same time. Tio and Tapu, the other Samoan tag team. Boxer turned wrestler, so it goes. Rocky Johnson, Dr. Frank. Ken Lucas is here. Tojo Yamamoto, Ricky and Robert Gibson, Plowboy Frazier, Bob Armstrong, Jackie Fargo, Hickerson and Condrey. We even talked about Tommy Rich making the jump from the Gulas side to the Jarrett side in the February of the last episode.
Yes, I mean that was the only thing that you could see where right after Jarrett resigns, you see this up and coming talent we now know is somewhat of a legend, having been an NWA world champion,
right? Switching
sides and then being buried in the local promotion's weekly newsletter.
Now, we have another podcast here on WrestleCopia, Dangerous Conversations, with Doug Gilbert and Tommy Rich, and the host of that show, Gene Jackson, actually asked Tommy about this jump, and Tommy really didn't have any major recollection of it, and he's got a pretty great memory, to be honest with you, in regards to the wrestling history. And Tommy just said he wasn't a fan of Gulas, and he liked Jerry Jarrett, and that was pretty much the beginning and the end of that. It wasn't like a big, giant political thing for Tommy, but at the same time, he was also asked about that slamagram comment, where Tommy was slammed, and Tommy had never heard anything about it. Of course, wrestlers didn't pay attention to the programs, and so there wasn't a whole lot to that, but it's kind of interesting when you pointed that out. Tommy was really the only one verbally slammed in front of the fans in regards to basically trying to bury him to a degree.
Right, and Jarrett actually broke Tommy into the business, so I'm sure there was some loyalty in that regard that he was the one willing to train him and give him his start.
So Jerry Jarrett, we talked about this as well, averaged almost 7,000 fans per week back in January of 77 at the Mid-South Coliseum, in Memphis proper, and then 9,000 fans in February. So business is booming. Meanwhile, on the other side, I don't know that Nick Gulas runs a venue that holds 9,000 fans. I could be wrong. You can correct me in a moment here. But even if Nick Gulas sold out every week, I don't know if he's drawing the numbers that Jerry Jarrett's doing right now.
Right. I think most of the places that Gulas was running, I think maximum capacity would have been, to the 5,000 to 6,000 range. But also, I mean, we talked about just a huge talent disparity when you look at the headliners on each side of the promotions. When you've got, Lawler and Rocky Johnson and you've got Bullet Bob Armstrong coming in on one side, and then you've got the Russian Stomper and the Masked Executioner and
the Plowboy. Don't forget the Plowboy.
Yeah, well, the Plowboy's about to jump too.
I like that. So, spoiler alert, guys.
Lawler needs a driver, man.
That's true. Yeah. So, but I dare say when we were running down the results last time out, that the semi-main events in the Memphis side were still larger than the main events over on the Gulas side of things, which is just crazy to think about.
Yes. Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think the people, I mean, Jarrett has said for years, everybody wanted to work on my side of the territory. They knew the money was better. These results kind of, back that comment up.
I was just thinking the same thing when you said that, because everybody dips their toes into the Memphis side at the very, even the Russian Stomper becomes the Mad Russian for a week or two so over here in Memphis. So everybody tried to get a piece of that Memphis pie. Nobody was discriminating against the Jarrett side, which really helped Jerry along the way.
Right. He had a lot more options on, who he could cycle in, who he could cycle out, who he could put at the top of the card. When you look, it's just such a thinner roster in Nashville, and this is really going to bear itself out after the split. When you look at the cards they're bringing into Memphis that Gulas is bringing in, it's just I can't imagine people thinking those cards were going to draw.
Well, we've got so much going on already. You talked about Rocky Johnson coming in, demanding a contract to come in because, well, he had heard some things perhaps about the Tennessee territory, and he comes in with a gimmick where he's a boxer turned wrestler. We talked about the origins of Dr. Frank in the box, the Masked Strangler, which was Nick Gulas' answer to Dr. Frank, kind of, sort of. General Lawler being demoted back to a civilian thanks to complaints from the fans out there who didn't take kindly. Pork Chop Cash turning on Gorgeous George Jr. and the King out there to explain why for him. Even the McGuire twins coming to town. So very eventful episode number 1 we had, Steve.
Yeah, a lot going on. And I think this episode is probably going to be even more eventful because we really get into the meat of the split and what happens at this point.
So near the end of the last episode, you mentioned a figure that would be here in 77. He's not here yet, but he will be here shortly. That is a character by the name of Igor. And of course, we already have a Dr. Frank. We have a Strangler. So why not bring in Igor into the picture? and we asked the fans, the listeners out there, to do their homework, send us any information they might have on Igor. Unfortunately, I had a lot of guesses, which were clearly inaccurate. I do appreciate everybody out there trying, but I did my own digging, and I don't remember if I talked to you about this, because if I had, it's been several weeks ago. But I did my own digging, and I came up with the best. I don't want to call it a guess, because by all the information I found, it seems to be true. Igor was also Ken Dillinger, which was the man portraying Dr. Frank.
Okay, I did have one person reach out to me and said Igor was Mickey Poole.
Okay.
So I don't know. I tried to kind of look and see if I could definitively say it was Mickey Poole or Ken Dillinger. I can't, but so we'll go with yours, and it really doesn't matter. We know it wasn't Harley Race. No,
it definitely wasn't Harley Race. Like I said in the last episode, it was not Hillbilly Jim. So we can rule out the McGuire twins. But everything I could find was Ken Dillinger in results and discussion from people from that era. But also, I noticed Dr. Frank disappears and then Igor arrives. So I mean, there's another coincidence you can look at as well. So who was it? I can't say for positive, but the best educated guess we can come up with is Ken Dillinger at this point anyway, unless somebody corrects us out there.
There you go. We've narrowed it down to 80% one, 20% two, and there's probably also 50% who cares, right?
I think so. And so that's pretty much the last episode in a nutshell. So we can kind of move on, let everybody know what's coming up in this episode of the Memphis split of 77.
Well, this is really where I say the split gets real, because as we start this episode, Jarrett has not started his own company yet. Gulas still has the Channel 13 television program that's been on WHBQ, I think is the call letters in Memphis since like 1965. So he's still got the television. He still has the Mid-South Coliseum. Jarrett hasn't started running yet. It's really interesting to me. I'm not sure, who was getting all the money from Louisville and Evansville during this kind of gray period.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if Jarrett was still being paid for that, even though he had resigned from the company. But he will talk about those towns later, so we'll get some insight from him as well. And that's where we are. Do we want to start jumping into some results here?
Yeah, let me see what. Just a quick recap of last time. You told it was Valentine. It was this day, breaking the fourth wall. We're recording on Valentine's Day, and it was Valentine's Day of 1977, February 14th, that Jerry Jarrett reportedly resigned from the Memphis Wrestling Enterprises, per that commercial appeal, one of the many commercial appeals I'm sure you're going to be getting into. So that's where we were. We talked about the Tommy Rich jump. He leaves. He drops the tag titles on the 16th of February. He's in Memphis by the 20th, 4 days later, and away we go. We're ready to roll.
All right, sounds good. Well, with the Memphis side still being really hot, we have a sellout on March 1st in Memphis. Attendance 11,257. We've got Ricky and Robert Gibson wrestling a draw against Dutch Mantell and David Schultz. Bill Dundee and Tommy Gilbert defeating Phil Hickerson and Dennis Condrey by disqualification. George Jr. defeats Pork Chop Cash quickly. Getting that back win. Lawler defeats Tommy Rich, and then there's a world championship match. Harley Race defeated Rocky Johnson.
Wow.
And it's reported in the Action Ringside program, which is the Memphis wrestling program. Lawler interfered in the Race Johnson match, quote, costing Rocky Johnson the world's heavyweight championship. So a very kind of normal angle during that era where the world champion would wrestle the top babyface, the top heel, cost the babyface the match, and then that program continues.
Wow, attendance 11,000. I mean, we talked about it every week last episode, and still beginning to climb again. It's going to peak here pretty soon because I think the Coliseum only holds about 12,000 or so. But I'm looking at this card, and your opening match is the Gibsons versus Dutch Mantell and David Schultz. I think Jerry Jarrett's got something good going here.
Exactly. Well, and Memphis did so well with tag teams throughout the years, and really before Lawler, it was basically a tag team territory. You would always have kind of tag teams at the top of the show, but he continued even though he went with singles at the top. Tag teams were always very important in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. All right, now let's look at what's going on in Nashville. We've got the Strangler, who again we can narrow down to Mickey Poole or Don Bass. He defeated Leon Chandler. Danny Little Bear, Chief Thundercloud, and Butch Thornton defeated Eddie Sullivan, Bounty Hunter #1, and Jim Kent. Mm-hmm. So Butch Thornton was the son of Chattanooga, Tennessee announcer Harry Thornton. So okay. I'm sure a lot of our fans have probably seen Harry Thornton on some clips throughout the years.
Right.
And Thornton was kind of a part-time worker in the Gulas territory. He did work a few months in Kansas City in 1977, and I think that's the only time he was kind of a full-time worker.
So, related into the business here, would you say he was probably equally as good as George Gulas as well then?
I would imagine so.
Okay.
He was probably, in that Lynn Rossi, George Gulas, Thornton skill set, I'm sure.
Right. And Nashville is so stacked right now. I see here in the results, the Strangler coming back out for the second time in 3 matches.
Yes, and then Tojo Yamamoto defeats the Strangler, who was in the opener. So, the Strangler gets two big checks that night, I'm sure.
So does Tojo.
Yes. And then the Samoans, Tio and Tapu, as we mentioned before, not Alpha and Sika, not the more famous Samoans. They're basically in Tennessee this entire year on either side of the territory.
Okay.
They defeat Tojo and George Gulas by disqualification. And we kind of mentioned, in the last episode, George was really never working as a single during this time. And he was very, very seldom in the actual main event. He would be either in the semi-main event or in the mid-card.
Okay.
And then the final match, the Executioner versus Ken Lucas, ends with a time limit draw. So that feud is ongoing between the Executioner.
And to remind everybody, I believe you said the Executioner was Curtis Smith, just in case anybody was curious here.
Yeah, kind of a long-term tag team wrestler working under a hood generally. Right. Did want to talk about the Bounty Hunters quite a bit. I remember the Bounty Hunters when I was a very small child. They had a big run in Memphis in 1977. They were on top a lot during that run. One of the Bounty Hunters, Jerry Novak, was actually from Slovakia. The other one, David Novak, his real name was Charles Melvin. He was from Florida. And in my mind, they were a much bigger deal than they actually were because, after that big Memphis run, they certainly had some territorial titles, but they never worked on top either here in Nashville or in Memphis again. But just kind of the old style, big brawling heel team that you would see in the South. And if you look up the Bounty Hunters wrestlers on YouTube, you will see a Memphis studio match that they're in, where it's kind of a squash match. And Jarrett had a quote on the Bounty Hunters. They were one of the first teams I booked when I started in Memphis, along with the Greens, which would be Don and Al Green. They helped me pop the Memphis end. Jimmy Kent was their manager. We drew a lot of money with the Bounty Hunters. All right. So probably a deal what was the first time in the territory. They got the big push. They did really well. But after you had the big push once and you've done your jobs on the way out, maybe you never really recapture that level of heat or interest again.
Right.
Okay. We go back to Memphis on the 6th of March, and this is a Sunday show at the Mid-South Coliseum. And again, it's interesting that, you have these completely different crews. Gulas didn't really change the composition of the crews a lot, during this weird time frame. Mm-hmm. But you've got, which he certainly could have done, and it's kind of bizarre that he didn't. David Schultz and Dutch Mantell defeated Tommy Gilbert and Buddy Wayne in the opener. Bill Dundee, Ricky and Robert Gibson draw Phil Hickerson, Dennis Condrey, and here's a strange name, J.J. Dillon.
Wow. J.J.
Dillon comes in for a shot in Memphis on this Sunday. Lawler and Porkchop Cash defeat Tommy Rich and Gorgeous George Jr. And Southern champ Rocky Johnson defeats Abdullah the Butcher.
Wow.
A name you really don't associate much with Memphis.
Definitely.
But Abby was in both Memphis and Nashville, as we'll see. During this year. And
I have no doubt the number one free agent, Abdullah the Butcher, he'll work for anybody.
Well, and he really was smart in booking himself like a special attraction.
Yeah.
He didn't stay in territories too long, but, he could come in and he could boost a house for a week or two, and then he could move on someplace else. And that was the beauty of the territory system, right?
Absolutely. And he utilized it more and better than anyone, I'd have to say.
Right. I did include a Birmingham result in here, and I don't need to go through the whole card on this night. It was on March 7th.
Okay.
But according to the wrestling database that I've been using, at the end of the night, the final match, Ken Lucas defeated the Strangler, and the Strangler was unmasked as Don Bass. Okay. So it may have been the situation where sometimes Don Bass was the Strangler and sometimes Mickey Poole. Who knows? But right. So that's why it's hard to be definitive.
Now, did that stick? Do you know, the Strangler being unmasked? Did it stick, or was that just for a one night, one city deal?
The Strangler will pop up again in some places.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dr. Frank will pop up after he loses the Loser Leave Town, but he was in another town that he didn't lose in, so I guess it's okay.
Well,
right?
Yeah, absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. So we go back to Nashville on March 9th. We've got a 7-man battle royal that includes Haystack Calhoun, and he wins with Ricky Field. So I don't know. I guess they won as a tag team.
Gonna split the purse, man.
Split the purse, man. Split the $2,500 or whatever it was. Chief Thundercloud, Danny Little Bear, Don Bass, Eddie Sullivan, and Leon Chandler were all in this. And, of course, all these names are going to be on the card. Chief Little Thundercloud defeated Leon Chandler. Chandler was just a part-time local guy on the Nashville scene. Mm-hmm. Danny Little Bear versus Eddie Sullivan, time limit draw, 10 minutes. Ricky Fields defeats Don Bass, who we heard was in earlier. Tojo Yamamoto and George Gulas, time limit draw against the Samoans. It seems like this match is happening every day.
Yeah. 30 minutes of Gulas, man. I don't know.
30 minutes. And then there's a karate gloves match. We start getting into these sort of gimmick matches with Ken Lucas. I think there's a tape where he talks about being in a boxing match against the Executioner. This one is a karate gloves match.
And
there's
okay, that's a new
karate gloves, yeah. So there's a quote in the Slamagram, one of these made-up interviews, most likely, but the Executioner said, "I live with my hate 24 hours each day. If you don't hate, you won't ever make it in pro wrestling." Okay. And I just thought that was just kind of cute.
So which one of these guys studied the martial arts that they're bringing karate gloves to this epic match?
Yeah, I don't know. The Executioner was doing like the loaded hood gimmick, I think, or maybe he was using a loaded glove gimmick. Maybe that was the deal. Maybe it was a loaded glove gimmick and so offset the loaded glove. They
did a draw last week here in Nashville, and they bring it back. Of all the gimmick matches, they decide we need karate gloves for this one. I got you. Okay. All right.
Yeah. I'm sure that boosted the house. I so wish we had these numbers for the Nashville I just can't imagine the business being great right now. But anyway, the 12th of March is important. That's Gulas' last TV show on Channel 13.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I've heard different things. I've heard that Nick was just sending in tapes from other towns with matches, and then that Lance Russell and Dave Brown would just promote the Memphis show based upon those tapes. And I've heard that he continued the studio wrestling. So I'm not really sure that weird kind of 3 to 4 week period after Jarrett left, how it was being promoted. But we know at this point that, the things that are in the works, and Jarrett's going to be starting his own promotion.
Right.
Now I'm going to go to an article in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and it says, fans Lawler respond as announcer Russell bows out. So this is an article about Lance no longer being the wrestling announcer. It doesn't show the date specifically on this article that I can find, and it doesn't show who wrote the article. It says, after 17 years on WHBQ, Lance Russell is finished as a studio wrestling announcer.
Wow.
So that would have meant that they were doing that on WHBQ started in 1960. I think I said 65. It's 1960. And 13-year-old Kevin Jones still can't believe it. And there's a picture of Lance Russell with young fan Kevin Jones, who's a very dapperly dressed 13-year-old African-American kid. I think Lance Russell is the best there is, said Kevin, who grew up watching studio wrestling. I know he's the best. I don't know what they're changing for. It's going to be like a whole new world in wrestling. WHBQ would cancel the show on March 12th. Studio wrestling will now be televised by WCTV Channel 5 with Clay Conrad doing the announcing from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. each Saturday. Russell, WHBQ's program director, also stepped down as announcer for Monday Night Wrestling at the Mid-South Coliseum. There's a quote from Lance. I've known most of these guys, quote the wrestlers, since they were fresh, green kids in the business. It's been a distinct part of my life for a long, long time. But I like to play golf and tennis and go fishing. I'm looking forward to doing that on the weekends. For the first few weeks, however, Russell had trouble getting wrestling out of the system. He says he spent about 48 Saturdays in the studio each year and has never missed more than 2 shows in a row. I'll probably get dressed and come down to the studio for 3 weeks before I realize it's over, he said. Wrestling fans have been vocal in their response to Russell's departure. And again, this is one wrestling fan, Kevin Jones. It's going to be funny without Lance here to commentate, said Jones, who has sold Wrestling Magazine at the Coliseum for 2 years. Nobody can do it like Lance. All my life I've watched him since I was real little. I think they should have a situation where he goes to Channel 5 or they go back to 13.
Wow.
Then Kevin turned to a reporter. I want to know if you could see about getting Lance back. All right, so here's a little pause, a little space break in the article.
So we have this Kevin Jones character to thank for everything. It sounds like.
Oh my God, he's a quote machine. He was ready. He was 13 and ready for prime. He'd been media trained.
Can't believe he didn't get hired.
Yeah. I tried to look him up to see if he was still out there, but Kevin Jones is a pretty generic name, so I couldn't narrow anything down.
Good luck with that one.
Yeah, but based on the math, he'd be about 60 these days, I guess. So hopefully he's still out there. Mm-hmm. Last Monday, on his final night as Coliseum announcer, Russell was besieged by questions, the same questions he'd been answering all week by telephone. We've gotten a lot of calls, Russell said. All they want to know is the same thing. Is it really true? They ask if I'm going to Channel 5. I tell them I'm not going to Channel 5. Davey, parenthesis his sidekick Dave Brown, is not going to Channel 5, and that I don't know what's going to happen to the crowds at the Coliseum. You can't be connected with wrestling as long as I have without being effective. I've gotten a lot of gratifying calls. Lance probably had a pretty good idea at this point that he and Dave were going to Channel 5, I would think. but he's kayfabing it, which he probably has to do because he's still getting paid to be the program director for Channel 13.
Yeah. Even Lance, man, little Carney and Lance here.
Right. Wrestling brings out the Carney in everyone. Here's a very interesting name. D.A. Noel, Vice President and General Manager of WHBQ, says the decision to cancel wrestling was not made on the spur of the moment. Even Ed Sullivan went off after a while, Noah said. Wrestling had a good audience, but a lot of other things do too. When a favorite soap opera goes off the air, we get the same kind of inquiries. So this guy is really, really downplaying. Oh, we lost our highest rated show, but
Right.
life happens, right? Jerry Lawler, star of the Memphis wrestling cast, said he will too miss Russell. He
Cast.
seemed to be the cast. Yeah,
It's
isn't that
like
funny?
it's like Fame, the cast of Fame.
Yeah, it's like a play. He seemed to be the perfect foil for my insults, Lawler said. Nevertheless, Lawler will adjust to Russell's absence easier than most fans. My only problem, he said, will be getting used to an announcer without a big nose. So the fact that this was probably about a week before the actual news show started, I'm guessing, based on the timeline. But it's news in the local newspaper that
The newspaper?
Memphis is that Lance will no longer be the announcer and that WHBQ is no longer carrying the television program.
That's a pretty big deal, as we all know.
Right. And I love that quote from the general manager, just like,
Blew it off.
yeah, we look at top-rated shows all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a complicated world out there.
Yeah, you got to cancel shows. The stories have come to an end, man.
Exactly. So that's interesting, and we'll have a lot more to say after we get to the point where Jarrett opens his territory about how that transition went from the different stations in Memphis. Mm-hmm. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But tonight we're going to go back to the Mid-South Coliseum, and this is where you can kind of see they did a tag team tournament for new Southern Tag Team Champions. Attendance is not announced on this particular card. Mm-hmm. I don't think a lot of work went into this. I think this is one of those.
This is one of those old school Memphis cards where you do just slap a tournament and throw it out there for the week. It feels like, because we've seen a lot of those over the years.
Right.
Some interesting teams, though.
The interesting teams. I don't have all of the results. I do have the final results. So here's the different teams. We've got Pork Chop Cash and Dr. Frank. They were taking on Ricky and Robert Gibson in the first round match. David Schultz and Dutch Mantell were taking on Haystacks Calhoun and Tommy Gilbert.
Wow, there you go.
Haystacks Calhoun does a rare Memphis appearance.
Yeah, he's working both sides of the territory right now. He just worked for Gulas. Now he's over here working for the Memphis side.
Yeah, and like Abby, Haystacks was booked as an attraction. I've got notes that here's the different places he worked in 1977. What we would know now is the Mid-South territory, Tennessee, Florida, Amarillo, Detroit, WWF, Tennessee again, Mid-South again, and California. So he always had a bag pack, that's for sure.
That's a lot of traveling for a guy his size.
Yeah. Billed at 6'4", 602 pounds.
Yeah.
I wonder if he ever teamed with the McGuire twins.
They did. There's actually a picture of all three of them in the ring together. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, that's almost a literal ton of fun, isn't it?
You can hear Gorilla Monsoon right now talking about that ring being reinforced. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. All right. The other tag teams in the tournament, Hickerson and Condrey against Rocky Johnson and Bill Dundee. Jerry Lawler and Jim White, rare Jim White. Yes, against George Jones and Tommy Rich. And we know the finals, Hickerson and Condrey end up beating the Gibsons for the tag team championship.
And just to correct you real quick there, because you said Tommy Rich team with George Jones, I want to be very clear that George Jones was not a professional wrestler that I know of. And it was Gorgeous George Jr.
I'm actually reading a book about Tammy Wynette and George Jones, and my mind is
I know how that works.
Cross-fired right now.
Yeah,
do you know kind of the backstory on Jim White and why he wasn't wrestling so much after?
No.
Oh, okay. Mm-mm. So Jim White had started wrestling back in 1959 on the eastern side of the Tennessee territory. Was never really a big in a money-making spot until he got with Lawler in the early 70s, made, Lawler and White become the tag team champions that headline Memphis while before they're getting Lawler ready to be a big single star.
Right.
Well, in the meantime, Jim White marries a lady named Lily Thomas. Are you familiar with that name?
I know a Lily Tomlin, but not a Lily Thomas, not off the top of my head.
Okay. Lily Thomas was a female wrestler in the 1970s.
Okay. She
was an African-American female wrestler in the 1970s.
All right.
And so basically, Jim White gets so much heat in the locker room in the South in the 1970s for marrying a black woman that it's just too much of a pain for promoters to put him on the cards.
Wow.
So you will see him being booked occasionally in the mid 70s, but basically just in fill-in roles.
Well, that's true love, man. If he's given up, I know a lot of guys that were dating or married to women that were far more acceptable, I guess, in that time frame, and they still would have rather just went on their wrestling adventures than been home with the family. So it's very commendable of him to, stick with whom he loved. I'd never heard that story. I wasn't aware of that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I don't know how long that marriage lasts. I know he had another marriage after that I think lasted longer. But, when you're not a wrestler, marriages tend to last a lot longer. So.
Well, that's what happens when keeping it real goes wrong then, I guess, if he had to remarry. But that's
yeah, exactly. Let's go back to Nashville on March 16th. We got Ricky Fields defeating Don Bass in the opener, Eddie Sullivan defeating Butch Thornton, the team of Danny Littlebear and Chief Thundercloud defeating the Bounty Hunters, the Samoans defeat Tojo and George Gulas in the feud that will never end, and the Executioner defeats Ken Lucas. So we're just really recycling these same matches over and over.
If George Gulas wasn't the son of Nick Gulas, I would say, how funny would it have been if all four of these guys jumped and they continued these matches on the other side of the circuit?
Right. This has been like the poor man's version of the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express. You take the same feud to every territory, right?
Really poor man version, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, the trailer park version.
There you go.
This was I thought this was a funny quote in the Slamagram from Samoan's manager Ken Hawk. I imagine he didn't actually say these words. I just thought it was funny. I had taken two men who were just a fair amount better than preliminary wrestlers and transformed them into champions. We are to wrestling what Leonardo da Vinci is to painting or Sinatra is to singing. Wow. So I'm sure Scott Teal wrote that on the back of a napkin and then typed it up. But I thought that was funny. I also have a note here that Ricky Fields was the son of Gulf Coast promoter Lee Fields. So we see Ricky working up here in Nashville for a bit, probably just taking a break from the home territory. So I want to kind of transition back into the television station issue now. Now, we're going to go back in time for the young people listening. We didn't have cable television in the 1970s, ladies and gentlemen.
Back in my day.
And back in my Grandpa Steve's going to tell you about the old days. So Memphis was our primary media when I was growing up. We got 3 Memphis television stations: Channel 3, which was CBS; Channel 5, NBC; Channel 13, which was ABC. And I think we got 3 other stations besides that. So we had 6 television stations to watch in the 1970s. So when you're looking at, trying to get wrestling on television, those were really the only 3 options you had in Memphis at that time. You didn't have any UHF, you didn't have cable, you did not have any other options. So here's a lengthy quote from Jerry Jarrett about starting his own promotion. I called key talent and advised them of my plans. Tojo and Fargo, who I just knew would stick with me, stayed with Gulas. Lawler and most of my men just asked what to do and said they were with me. I advised them to keep wrestling, and I let them know when I was ready. Lawler and I went to see Maury Griner at Channel 5 in Memphis. I'm going to stop there for a second because sometimes this story is told that Lawler went on his own to see the Memphis Channel 5 studio head.
I wonder who told that story.
Yeah, sometimes it's told that Jarrett went on his own. This time they both went at the same time. I think this is probably the correct version of the story. Okay, back to Jarrett's quote. Mm-hmm. At the time, Channel 5 was in 3rd place in the market, and Channel 13, which had the wrestling show, was number 1. I told Maury that I could bring wrestling to him, and I could also bring Lance Russell and Dave Brown. I explained that not only could he get the number 1 television and show in Memphis away from Channel 13, but he could get the program director, Russell, and the number 1 weatherman, Brown. I promised him that we would become the number 1 station within a year. Well, he believed in us, and true to my word, Channel 5 became the top-rated station in less than a year. The move sealed my relationship with Channel 5 for years to come and also launched my promotion company. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Buddy Fuller partnership that we'd mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. After securing the television deal, I called Buddy Fuller and told him I was opening my own promotion. Buddy had never liked Nick, so he began helping me inform the NWA membership of the split. But where's the line of people who like Nick? Where are they at?
It's a very short. It's like that line for Virgil back in the day for the autographs.
Exactly. Lonely Nick at the autograph table. I took Buddy as a partner mainly for political reasons and also because Roy, Buddy's father, was responsible for me being in the business in the first place. We had to start our Memphis promotion at Ellis Auditorium because the Mid-South Coliseum contract was in the name of Gulas Welch. Channel 13 realized they had lost their top-rated TV show, so rather than have a second-rate program, they chose to cancel the contract. This left us the only promotion with a television show, and the battle for Memphis was over. Because I had started Louisville, Lexington, and Evansville myself, there was never a real fight for those towns. So almost without a real fight, I had what had been known as the Memphis end of the promotion. Fargo and Tojo finally returned to the fold, but the relationship was never the same. So I've heard other people say, once the split was made and Jarrett made the deal with Channel 5, Channel 13 just did not want to be involved in wrestling at that point. I think Lawler being such a huge star in that area, if you didn't have Lawler on Memphis TV, it was just going to look second rate at that time. And then Channel 3, the other station that would have been optioned, just never showed any interest. I have read that there were a couple of guys that we'll talk about in the article we're about to read, named Guy Bates and Bert Bates, who were active in the local political circles in Memphis. Mm-hmm. And they tried to reach out on Nick's behalf to get him a television program, and the stations just weren't interested.
Isn't that amazing that some people, the higher ups, and it happened with Turner many years later when the corporate guys came in and didn't want Rasslin, WCW, even after the success it did have there in the mid-90s. And so think about the ratings that the Memphis show, the wrestling show, was doing prior to this, before they're switching here. And there's certain channels going, nah, we don't need that wrestling stuff.
Right. And, it was so different at that time because you either got 1 hour or an hour and a half of wrestling, and that was all you saw for the entire week. Mm-hmm. So, and you really didn't have the concept that, these same guys are wrestling Tuesday night in this city and Wednesday night in this city, Right. And so it seemed like the whole world was focused on this one city that you were seeing the wrestling promoted for.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Pro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Rasslin Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Rasslin Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Rasslin Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Rasslin, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, Videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia podcast network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
This is Wrestling Nostalgia, the podcast that dives into wrestling history. Hey, wrestling fans, I'm Dave Dynasty, and if you enjoy podcasts that are knowledgeable and history-driven, then Wrestling Nostalgia is for you. With great guests and fun interviews, there are over 200 episodes in our archives. We chat with several first-time guests and often cover topics not discussed on other podcasts. Look up Wrestling Nostalgia on your favorite podcast platform and visit all of our links at linktree/WrestlePod. That is linktr.ee/RASSLEPOD. And remember, wherever you go, whatever you do, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.
All right, so 319, Jarrett's first show's on Channel 5. He really has no television opposition at this time. All right, we're going to move into a very lengthy and very interesting article. This is published on the 20th of March, which is the same day that Jarrett has his first show in Memphis, and it's called Tug of War is On for Memphis Wrestling Limelight. And this was written by a man named Joel Biereg, or something of that nature, Biereg.
There you go. Give him credit.
This is a very lengthy article. So we're going to take some breaks, but I think it's interesting in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Last week, Nick Gulas had everything a wrestler promoter could ask for: the Mid-South Coliseum, a Saturday morning television show, and Jerry Lawler. Memphis Wrestling Enterprises, owned by Gulas, Burt Bates, and Roy Welch, was the only wrestling show in town. Beginning today, however, there will be two professional wrestling programs in Memphis: Gulas Monday night card at the Coliseum, and Jerry Jarrett's Sunday night production at the Everett Cook Convention Center. Both sides are prepared for war. It's a matter of who the public is going to support, said Gulas, a Nashville-based promoter who's been in the business for 42 years. I may go down, but I'm going to be there fighting all the way. It's a matter of survival. Jarrett, a Gulas employee for the past 8 years, is striking out on his own, and according to most wrestling observers, he's off to an impressive start. Since resigning from Memphis Wrestling Enterprises on February 14th, Jarrett has lured away most of the Monday night wrestlers: Lawler, Rocky Johnson, Bob Armstrong, Gorgeous George Jr., Jackie Fargo. Not really. Phil Hickerson, Dennis Condrey, Johnny Walker, Robert and Ron Fuller, Tommy Rich, David Schultz, Dutch Mantell, Bill Dundee, Carl and Kurt Von Steiger, Rick and Robert Gibson, Tommy Gilbert, Buddy Diamond, and Pork Chop Cash. And I think what they've done is they probably reported everybody who they thought was going to be on that first card. Wow. And what you see on that first card is a lot of the Knoxville talent coming in, Robert and Ron Fuller, right, the Von Steigers. So, yeah, it's not like those people were full-time in the area. Back to the article. Sure. In addition, Jarrett's package will include the studio wrestling program on Saturday mornings. WHBQ-TV Channel 13 canceled the Gulas-produced program March 12th. Meanwhile, Jarrett worked out an agreement with WMC-TV Channel 5, which kicked off its studio wrestling yesterday morning with a show from 9:30 to 11. I will stop and point out one more time that Lance was still the program director at Channel 13. He probably knew he was going to Channel 5. He probably had a pretty big role in making sure that Channel 13 did not put on the wrestling show.
Well, yeah, no, what can you do?
Right. You feather your own nest in life.
There you go.
WMC officials said wrestlers' regular time through the spring and summer will be 11:30 to 1 p.m., leading into NBC's baseball game of the week. Quote from Jarrett, I realize this is a new company and a new building on a new day on a new station. I am well aware that I have a heck of a job ahead of me, but I'm also aware that I can come up with top talent. People will support us. Jarrett, 34, is a former professional wrestler who got his start under Gulas. Jarrett's mother, Miss Christine Jarrett, has been Gulas's bookkeeper for 30 years, and Jarrett was Gulas matchmaker for a year before he resigned. So we know he had been booker for much longer than a year, but they kind of kayfabe that. Some management problems developed, and they culminated with my resignation, said Jarrett, who lives in Hendersonville, Tennessee. It was a management fight, and I lost, so I resigned. They, quote, meaning Gulas, Bates, and Welch, had the power. They owned it. I was just an employee, and the employee either lives by management decisions or he quits. I quit. After resigning, Jarrett asked the Monday Night Wrestlers to consider working for them. I offered them a better potential than what they have now. I got everybody I asked because they know that I've been there. I know how hard it is living in the road. Wrestling is a hard life. I know a man should be paid well for being a wrestler. Lawler, the main event on most Monday night cards, no longer a wrestler for the Gulas firm. One reason I'm wrestling for Jerry Jarrett is because he was a wrestler at one time. He knows about the problems of wrestlers. They had really gotten their stories together, didn't they?
No kidding.
Another reason is money. Now, when I quote these figures, anything to do with money, multiply them by 5 in today's dollars. Jarrett says Lawler will make about $150,000 this year. So my back of the napkin math would mean that would be $750,000 in today's money. Mm. Are these real figures? I don't know.
I thought you were going to say multiply them by 5 and then divide them by 3 because we really don't.
Exactly. But we do know that Lawler was getting 10% of the gate after he started with Jarrett on the Memphis cards.
Yeah,
so
looking forward to this. So the war starts here this week, March 20th, at the Cook Convention Center for Jarrett, and then the following day, March 21st, Nick Gulas gets to run the Mid-South Coliseum. So this is going to be fun when we get there.
It is going to be fun. I'll be paid more here than I am at the Coliseum. When asked about the financial arrangement, basically Lawler saying I'm getting a pay raise. Rocky Johnson, another popular performer, says he's, quote, happy with the deal Jarrett offered him. My contract is bigger and better. Jarrett, has a better organization. Jarrett says Johnson will probably make $105,000 this year. With Lawler, Johnson, and the others moving to the convention center, Gulas will revise its Monday night show. So then they go over.
Now and I can't help but laugh.
Yeah, well, they go over what the Gulas card will be. I'm going to skip that for now because we're going to talk about that later. And again, this is a very lengthy article. I'm not even close to being done. Memphis Wrestling Enterprises has a lease on the Coliseum that runs through June 30th. Guy Bates, who has been responsible for Monday Night Wrestling during the illness of the father, says the show will go on. We have just as good a talent as Jarrett says Bates, presumably with a straight face. He's got his own wrestlers, and we'll have our own. It'll be 2 entirely separate shows. Neither Bates nor Gulas was completely surprised when Jarrett left to form his own company. I can understand how young people are, Bates says, and you can't stop competition. I feel some disappointment, but there's certainly no malice involved. Gulas's feelings are stronger. We're the people who made Jerry Lawler, and we are the ones who made Jerry Jarrett. But Lawler is a good wrestler, and Jarrett is a good matchmaker. I can't say anything about the boy, meaning Lawler. He made us a lot of money. So, here we go into more financials. In 1976, Memphis Wrestling Enterprises drew 335,000 fans for 51 dates. According to Bates, Memphis ranks first in the world in total wrestling draw. But, Memphis, nicknamed the Grapple Capital, support 2 programs. That's what we're going to find out, Bates says. Lawler, it's hard to say until it's tried. That was the one question I asked myself in making the decision. The answer I came up with was maybe, but I had to go to the assumption that it wouldn't, meaning that 2 promotions wouldn't work out. I made my decision based on the fact that Jerry Jarrett will be the most successful. A central issue seems to be whether wrestling fans will go to the convention center on Sunday nights after having spent Monday nights at the Coliseum since 1972, when construction of the convention center prompted a move. On Wednesday, Jarrett and his attorney, David, I think it says Kaywood, went before the Mid-South Coliseum board to discuss the possibility of booking dates for his card. The board told Jarrett he would be eligible to rent the Coliseum for any date available, providing the date doesn't fall the day before or after a date booked by the Gulas firm. The board told Jarrett it was unwritten policy against the booking of back-to-back events. We feel like it dilutes the drawing power of both events, said Joe Pipkin, chairman of the Coliseum board. After the meeting, Jarrett said he would not see dates at the Coliseum unless the convention center proves unsuccessful as a wrestling facility. I just wanted to be sure we have the option of moving to the Coliseum if the convention center doesn't go over with the fans, Jarrett said. Regarding the move to the convention center, Lawler said, I was apprehensive at first. There seemed to be some sort of stigma about the downtown area, but I've changed my mind. And let me tell you, there was a big stigma about Memphis downtown in 1977. If it's something they want to see, they'll come down for it. As for the switch from Monday night to Sunday as a basic wrestling night, Lawler said the fans will adjust. Checking his personal records, Lawler noted that because of scheduling conflicts, wrestling at the Coliseum recently has been held on days besides Monday. They run down dates when it was held on Sundays and Tuesdays. All right, we'll get back into some of the more numbers now, which are interesting. During the last fiscal year, from July 1st, 1975 to June 30th, 1976, wrestling took in $7,972.649 for 50 dates at the Coliseum. Promoters pay the Coliseum 12.5% of the gate, or $1,000 minimum, whichever is greater, for rental. The rental for the fiscal year was about $99,000. About $30,000 was paid to the Coliseum for its security, including 10 policemen each night, printing of tickets, etc. The promoters are required by law to donate a portion of the gate to any patriotic organization, and Gulas, Welch, and Bates donate to two such organizations in Memphis, American Legion Post No. 1 and the Beale Street Elks Club. The percentage given to such organization varies according to a spokesperson for the Tennessee Athletic Commission, which controls the professional events. William T. Jameson, Jr., commander of Post No. 1, refused to release the percentage without calling a special meeting of the group's executive committee, although it is believed that both the Legion and Elks share 2%. The spokesman for the Elks was not available for comment. Right. The promoters grossed about $650,000 last year, and this figure, according to Gulas, is shared equally between Gulas, Welch, and Bates. I'm not sure that the Bates brothers, who were basically just local political figures, were actually getting equal share of the revenue.
Yeah, that was news to me. I had never even heard those names before, so I was unaware.
Yeah, and I think they were, at least one of them was on city council. They were very active in Democratic Party politics in the city. And I think they basically ran interference if there were any complaints from the Coliseum about anything that was happening via the wrestling programs. So, they had the title of, quote, promoters, but I think it was just wrestling promoters like to have political people in their corner in those days.
Gotcha.
It is estimated that before taxes and expenses last year, the promoters shared about $300,000. Now Nick's going to poor mouth himself here. I've got a lot of expenses in my office and other things that figured in. I made between $70,000 and $75,000 last year after everything was taken care of, but I can only speak for myself. I couldn't tell you what the other 2/3 of the promoting group made.
Of course. So who's dictating the money here when one of the promoters doesn't know who was making what here? That doesn't.
Yeah. Nick's just on rice and beans here. It's a tough situation. The average gate at the Coliseum figures to be about 15,852 on an average attendance of about 7,000. Gates said that the biggest draw, this is a very strange transition. They're talking about how wrestling does in other cities. Gates said the biggest draw is in St. Louis. In St. Louis, the average attendance is 11,000, but you have to take into consideration that we only wrestle in that city every 2 weeks, instead of every week in Memphis. But it makes a difference as far as the average attendance is concerned. So it's almost like insinuating that Gulas is promoting in St. Louis, but he's saying the NWA promotes in St. Louis every 2 weeks.
Right, absolutely.
Gulas said he had wrestling in 34 cities with a total of 18 television stations carrying the action. Now here's some other averages that are interesting. Nashville averages about 3,500. Denver, 7,500. San Francisco, 9,000, and in Madison Square Garden in New York, 22,000 once every month. The action in New York also sells out the 14,400-seat Felt Forum, which is downstairs in the Garden.
Oh, well, hold on. The Felt Forum holds 14,000 people? That's
according to this 1977
that's
article.
news to me.
So basically, 14,000 people are showing up to watch it on closed circuit television.
And I also happen to know that San Francisco was on its ass right now before Kevin Sullivan and Bob Roop got there. So this is crazy. All right, whatever.
Yeah, these are very interesting numbers. Very interesting numbers. All right, we move on from that. Jarrett said that he will open at 8 o'clock tonight in the convention center with a seating capacity of about 11,000. The potential capacity, he says, is about 16,000. Lawler sees himself as a factor that can make Jarrett or break Gulas. I'm a star. Whether I'm a star in Memphis or New York, I would help either organization I went with. Gulas said, they've got Jerry Lawler, which we haven't got, but I think our guys are just as good as theirs. We've got a lot of new faces. All right, important part of the article here.
Okay.
What Gulas lacks, however, is a Saturday morning television program on which to showcase those new faces.
There it is.
Bates said he tried to get a show on WREG Channel 3, but they said they didn't have a time slot for it. All I can do is take their word for it. According to people in the business, studio wrestling and live wrestling complement each other. TV is how people get to know the wrestlers, said Lawler. It's how they decide who to like and who to dislike. WHBQ announced the March 12th show would be its last, but D.A. Noel, the station general vice president and general manager, said the move wasn't as sudden as it seemed. It's been under consideration for a long time, Noel said.
Mm-hmm.
The time came where we just wanted to try some other forms of programming. We weren't in a hassle with anybody. We have no complaint or quarrel with the wrestling people. So again, Noel's
they can be carny too.
What the hell? It's just another
the TV business can be carny too, you see. Tell the story the way they want.
Jarrett, who produced the program for WHBQ, said he informed the station they would resign from Gulas' firm February 14th.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been doing the program, and I felt I owed them some advance warning. I had advised WHBQ that I was leaving the Gulas organization, but that I would be in a position to furnish them with a wrestling program. When I sensed some hesitancy on their part, I went directly to Channel 5. Phil Slavak, program director for WMC, said Jarrett's offer was one of those good things you just can't anticipate. According to Arbitron ratings for October 1976, studio wrestling reached about 135,000 households at 11:30 Saturday morning.
Wow.
By comparison, a Sunday night World Series game that same month reached 136,000 homes.
Whoa.
So basically, wrestling is as big in Memphis as a World Series.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Quoting the ratings for last October, Slavik said Little House on the Prairie reached 144,000 homes, Sanford and Son 129,000, and Policewoman 123,000. Mm-hmm. So Jerry Lawler is a bigger star in Memphis than anybody on network television, basically.
That is absolutely insane. You know, I grew up on some reruns of Red Fox, but yeah, he cannot outportray Michael Landon was on TV for like 30 years straight. He went straight from Bonanza to Little House to Highway to Heaven. And even he is no bigger than the king when it comes to Memphis, Tennessee. Amazing.
I think people have a hard time understanding just how huge Lawler was in Memphis during this era, because if you didn't grow up with it, you didn't make those distinctions that Lawler was a local guy and this was on national television. I mean, he was a huge television star, and you're talking about a city with no sports teams at that time. So he was the biggest sports, personality in the city as well.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, Steve.
All right, back to the article. Wrestling draws a lot of folks, Slavik said. When you look at the ratings, you've got to sit up and take notice. Until Jarrett approached WMC, we hadn't given it much thought, Slavik said. We weren't interested in going head-to-head, but when WHBQ dropped it, we were definitely interested. It's a hell of a program. The key, Slavik said, will be Jarrett's Sunday night card at the convention center. It takes both to make it work. TV helps the live wrestling and vice versa. People had offered us canned wrestling shows before, but we didn't have anything live to go with it. All right, we'll finish the article here, a very lengthy article. Clay Conrad will be the WMC's wrestling announcer, replacing the popular Lance Russell and his sidekick Dave Brown. Russell, WHBQ's program director, had announced studio wrestling for all 17 years. He's considered one of the better announcers in the country, Slavek said. Certainly, Lance and Dave Brown had a lot to do with the show's success, but I think the wrestling is the big thing. That's what people want to watch. Meanwhile, Gulas plans to keep pushing for a show on WREG. If we don't get TV, he said, we're going to have to work 10 times as hard to keep people coming. And so that completes that article. Kind of a very unusual to see such a lengthy, in-depth piece on professional wrestling in a daily newspaper of that era.
What do you know of Clay Conrad? Do you have any memories of him? Because I believe until Lance gets everything worked out and kind of slowly morphs his way over into Channel 5, I think Clay Conrad actually will be the first announcer briefly there. And he had to be around, I think, in his early 40s when I was doing research on him before. Do you remember anything about Clay Conrad?
Yeah, no, I think that he was just one of the television personalities on the station.
Okay.
From the clips I've seen, he looks completely lost in the world of professional wrestling. Like, I'm holding this mic and I don't know why I'm here and I don't know what I'm doing. But he did not try to interject himself, which was probably for the best from what I've seen. I think it was a couple of guys just thrown into this situation. Channel 5 already knew that Lance and Dave were coming over. Right. So they knew.
They had to keep that on the QT though, right? So even Clay might not have known his days were numbered. I don't really know. I'm sure he was thankful that he got to move on, but he had to hold the fort down. Hold the fort down for me, Clay, before we make our move. Me and Davey are coming. Don't you worry.
Yeah, I don't think it probably hurt his feelings a lot not to do that. He did not look like a man in his element, that's for sure.
Let's talk about that just really briefly, too. People that didn't get to grow up in that era, all those decades, even throughout the 1980s for me, we had our local guys who would do the news or do the sports or the weather or things like that. But some of them had side jobs. Maybe they would be part of hosting the late night movie or a early Sunday movie or something along those lines. We had a lot of that going on here in the Cleveland area. And so that constantly went on. These guys were contracted to this TV station, so they essentially did whatever they were told to do.
Right. You'd see them do sometimes like local game shows or local win the numbers, like a little lotto show or something, like that. You'd see them in a lot of different situations. Yes. All right. So now the war is real, and we have our first Memphis card at the Cook Convention Center for Jarrett on March the 20th. And again, this is a very lengthy card. He really wanted to load this card up.
Talk about snack of the deck.
Yeah. And like we mentioned, a lot of Knoxville workers came over for this first night.
So even though Jarrett split from Nick Gulas, I didn't mean to cut you, I apologize. It's Jarrett being able to make the play to get talent from outside, which is even funny when you think about it too. Nick Gulas, the long-standing promoter, gets outdone by Jerry Jarrett, the upstart promoter, so to speak here. He's able to make some calls and bring in some talent from outside.
I think I heard Ron Fuller say at one point, he started his promotion in Knoxville, I think in 1974. Mm-hmm. And he said when he first started, he was getting talent from Nick. And he said the talent was so bad, it almost killed the city. So he quickly realized this is not going to work out. Me, paying a booking fee to Nick Gulas to get less than stellar talent on the card.
And Ron also told that story. I don't know. I'm sure you're aware of it too, where Ron said that Nick tried to finagle 10%, pretending that he had owned 10% of the territory, and said, well, and then Ron makes the call to Roy Welch, his grandfather, and he's like, well, what's this about the 10%? And Roy, being as carny as he could, he said, well, we'll let it go. And so instead of saying we don't really own 10% to his grandson, he said, well, we'll do you a favor and we'll just let it go. But I thought it was funny. That's another thing, Roy Welch basically trying to take 10% of something he didn't own, trying to work Ron Fuller. So I'm sure he never forgot that either.
There's no honor among thieves.
No, not even in the family.
No. So the first card, very lengthy card, starts off with Jerry Bryant, Rick and Robert Gibson defeating Dr. Frank, Private Diamond, and the Mummy.
Ooh, the Mummy.
I'm not sure who the Mummy was.
Is Dr. Frank on this card? Man, they missed the boat if they didn't put these two together.
Yeah, Dr. Frank, Private Diamond, and the Mummy. So they're tag teaming together.
Oh yeah, okay. I don't know how I missed that. Okay, yeah, so they are on the same team. Okay, that's great. I love it.
And I think at one point Ron Wright might have worked as the Mummy in Memphis, but I don't know if it was during this time frame. All right, Wrestling 2, Johnny Walker defeated Pork Chop Cash via DQ. Hickerson and Condrey defeat George Wagner and Tommy Gilbert. Tommy Rich and Bill Dundee defeat Kurt and Carl von Steiger. Robert and Ron Fuller defeat David Schultz and Dutch Mantell. Gosh, I didn't count the number of names, but man, this is a big card. Rocky Johnson defeated Plowboy Frazier via DQ. Look who's back in the fold.
Mm-hmm. French fried taters.
And Jerry Lawler battled Bob Armstrong to a no contest. And again, Bob Armstrong showing that he was a really big draw in Memphis. It's something I really wasn't that aware of before I started this project. Bob drew some really big houses in Memphis working with Jerry Lawler during this time frame.
I mean, I just counted the names. 26 talents on this show. Nobody worked double duty that I can see. That's a hell of a lot. And I did catch Mr. Wrestling 2 is on this card. And going back to that commercial appeal, they mentioned Johnny Walker. So, a little bit of breaking kayfabe there. I don't know how they got that information.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not put that together. Oh. That's why you're the maestro. All right. I'm gonna kind of go now into kind of the Nick Gulas story one more time from Jarrett's perspective.
All right.
And I've thought about this in some different ways, but first I'll do Jarrett's quote. The George Nick story was truly a sad one. It's a simple case of a father who loved his son dearly, but was unable to dish out tough love. The results being that George grew up a very spoiled kid. George decided he wanted to wrestle, and at first Nick was reluctant. However, after George finally talked his father into letting him wrestle, Nick became his supporter and a fan. Nick turned a deaf ear to the wrestlers' and fans' criticism. It was really sad for those of us here. Nick went so far as to bring Harley Race in to work matches with George. George would work in Nick's towns, and the gates falling did not seem to get Nick's attention. When I would talk to Nick about judging George's ability by the box office, Nick would give 5 other reasons the house was bad. Finally, Nick decided that George had been in the towns on his end for too long and that George would do great on the Memphis end. For months, Nick's end of the business was a loss, which was supported by the profits from the Memphis end. This directly affected my money because I was an owner and the losses were deducted before profits were dispersed. This single problem led to Nick and I splitting up and Nick going out of business. So again, that's the narrative that, all of this is based on Nick or George Gulas. I did go back and George did work in Memphis for 3 months in 1975. And what they did was they teamed him up with Eddie Marlin and they worked very low on the card. So it was the old veteran with the young rookie, that time proven formula.
Sure.
And he was not put in a position to make any money. And so, I don't think this conversation about not wanting George Gulas in the territory really had anything to do with he's going to hurt our houses. It may have been more like he's going to hurt our morale, and I don't need George's son in the locker room, right?
Right, absolutely.
Because you never hear anyone who wrestled with George at the time really say anything positive about him. Dutch Mantell tells a story, I'm not sure whether it's true or not, that Nick got arrested for soliciting prostitutes twice on the same day at the same place.
Wow. So
he goes to a street corner, solicits a prostitute. She's an undercover cop. He gets arrested. He gets bailed. He goes back to the same corner, gets arrested again. So
wow. Unbelievable.
That's Dutch's story. And we
know how the stories work in the world of wrestling, but at the same time, boy, that's a interesting one for sure.
Right. So I think that George was just so disliked by the other wrestlers that it was a situation where, okay, I can hide this guy in my card, and I don't think it's really going to impact the card. But as a person and with the relationship he has as a father, do I want him in my business? And I would think that probably had more to do with it than the actual, I have to put him on top and I'm going to lose money with him.
Well, you tell so many fans out there who shame the fruit of the loins, if you will, some of these second generation stars that didn't necessarily make it, or maybe they got pushed a little harder than they deserve. You hear a lot of fans give their opinions on things, but you don't hear a lot of the wrestlers saying, "Oh, David Sammartino was a dick. Oh, Greg Gagne was a piece of shit." But you always hear these stories of George Gulas kind of being aloof to life in general.
Yeah, kind of did a lot of things that were socially awkward.
Yes, this is a good way to put it.
Yeah, I'm trying to be nice here. I'm trying to be nice. George is still out there in the world. I don't have any ill will toward him. You know,
no. He's a part of history, whether anybody likes it or not.
Right. He has a lot of baggage to carry around. That's for sure.
That's for certain.
All
his father was Nick Gulas. He's got that, already right in the thing. So
right. So here's the first Gulas card, March 21st, the next night, the Mid-South Coliseum, that he promotes on his own. And when we talked about Jarrett running a really loaded card, Nick said, I'm going to go the complete opposite direction of running a really loaded card.
That's right.
So the attendance this night was 1,964.
Wow.
The gate was reportedly just under $5,000. The opening match, Tony Marino defeats Leon Chandler.
The Batman.
Yes.
With two T's, guys. They got away with it for a while anyway.
There you go. Cora Combs defeats Lady Satan, Debbie Combs, under a hood. There's only 5 matches.
Wouldn't they flip-flop later? Wouldn't Debbie become just Debbie Combs and Cora would become Lady Satan later on when Cora aged a little further?
I think that probably did happen, yeah. And I've heard people say that when Debbie first got in the business, you could really see her mom just kind of leading her through the match. It was just very obvious that was the situation.
Well, I have some comments on this show, but I'll let you get through it first.
All right. The Bounty Hunters defeat Danny Little Bear and Chief Thundercloud. Semi-main event. Semi-main event. Tojo Yamamoto and George Gulas defeat the Crimson Terrors.
Dun, dun, dun.
Who the hell are the Crimson Terrors? I have no idea.
In the semi-main.
Semi-main. And in the main event, straight out of Detroit, Bobo Brazil defeated U.S. champ, the Sheik, via, of course, DQ.
Well, you can't have a Sheik and Bobo match without a disqualification in there. So let's look at this show for a moment now, shall we? We kick off with Tony Marino, who is not part of the territory, but that's all right. We're bringing in some talent. Cora Combs and Lady Satan, a ladies match. You got tag team action, the Bounty Hunters, kind of an established heel team. Then, instead of giving the Bounty Hunters the match with Tojo and Gulas, trying to do your first big show without Jerry Jarrett involved, you bring in a couple of guys who may be Cora Combs and Lady Satan under hoods. Who knows? The Crimson Terrors. And now the Crimson Terror is going to do the job there. And then your main event, because you don't have a Russian Stomper anymore, because Plowboy's made the jump. And now you have nobody left and no TV to boot at this point. And so you call up to the Sheik in Detroit and say, I need something. I got to have something here. And so we've watched every week the attendance climb 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000, 11,000. In just a matter of a couple weeks, we're down to under 2,000. So that says that the fans, they didn't just come out because it was Rasslin. They came out because they knew the talent. They were interested in the storylines and all of that went along with it. They draw 1,964, you said. I think we didn't mention how many Jerry Jarrett drew, though, which was 8,256, 8,256 fans. Yes, slightly down from his Mid-South Coliseum shows, but remember, as you pointed out, they moved to Sunday. They moved venues to, downtown, which is kind of seedy, you know what I mean? So, if you build it, they will come. I think 8,256 is very successful for a quote-unquote new promotion in a new venue on a new date.
Yeah. And you can tell, the war is almost over before it starts.
Exactly.
No television, no top tier talent in the area. We will see continuously throughout this year this kind of exchange between talent between Detroit and Nick, and obviously he and the Sheik had a good relationship. But Detroit in 1977 was not Detroit in 1971 or 2.
No.
Their crowds had gone down by about half at that time. So instead of 7,000-8,000 a week, they might be 3,000 a week. So it was on its way to being a dying promotion as well.
Right. The writing was on the wall, and the Sheik had already done all the Sheik things he could do by 77. And Bobo was no spring chicken either. Bobo had already been in the business forever. So it was the same routine. These guys had worked 1,000,000 times together, and that's what they bring here. They bring their normal shtick. And if it was the things that they did in Detroit, which I'm assuming it had to be, I don't know if the Memphis fans would have went for it. Outside of the blood and guts, yes, but just, you know how these matches went, 4 minutes in and out, the main event.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
So I said earlier there were 26 guys on the Jarrett card. I counted again, 24 guys on the Jarrett side, 14 guys on the Gulas side. So at least he drew a lot less, but at least he didn't have to pay out as many guys, I suppose, if you want to look for the silver lining.
Yeah. I'm sure Tony Marino and Leon Chandler enjoyed their $20 that night. And
there you go. Who knows if Debbie Combs got paid at all?
That's a lot of cheeseburgers in 1977.
There you go. Oh, where's Ken Patera?
Yeah. So now we'll go back to a Nashville card, see what's going on there. Mm-hmm. The Bounty Hunters are already in the opening match. This established tag team against Danny Little Bear and Chief Thundercloud. Ricky Fields defeats the Black Demon.
Probably one of the Crimson Terrors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Tio Topo and Mickey Poole defeat Tojo, George Gulas, and Jerry Barber. Thank you for doing the job, Jerry Barber. And Ken Lucas defeats the Executioner. So you got 4 matches on that card. Mm-hmm. But you have a new dining opportunity in the Nashville area.
Oh, is that so?
Are you aware?
No, I'm not. Please do.
Well, let's talk the Slamagram. Professional wrestlers get involved in many things, including investments of their own money. Tojo Yamamoto has a restaurant that specializes in delicious dishes such as barbecue ribs, pepper steak, fried rice, and egg rolls. His phone number for takeout orders is 865-2420. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, Tojo Yamamoto will make you a meal in Nashville in 1977.
I thought you were going to say spaghetti. I was about to mark out.
I once asked Tommy Rich, I said, what did you learn from Tojo? And he said, he taught me how to cook. So, there was something there. I can't do Tommy Rich, but plenty of other people can. All right. We'll go back to Memphis to the Cook Convention Center, March 27th. A much more kind of normal card. Attendance is down a little bit, but it's still 6,500. George Wagner, Tommy Gilbert, Ricky and Robert Gibson defeat David Schultz, Dutch Mantell, Plowboy Frazier, and Dr. Frank.
Do you know, and I apologize for cutting you off there, but I have to ask this question or I'll forget. Do you know why he went from Gorgeous George Jr. to George Wagner? Was it just the babyface turn? But it seems odd that you would lose that shtick.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why that. No idea. I don't know if they were phasing him out and they just wanted to kind of de-emphasize him. I'm not sure.
Okay, this looks like a handicap match if I'm reading this right.
I don't know. A lot of people they're just throwing in the card there. That's for sure. Robert and Ron Fuller defeated Pork Chop Cash and Jim Gillow. Gillow, whoever that is. Phil Hickerson and Dennis Condrey defeat Tommy Rich and Bill Dundee. Rocky Johnson defeats Abdullah the Butcher, getting his win back and his revenge there.
Abby did a job.
Well, yeah, and Lawler defeated Bob Armstrong in a, quote, submission match. So, backstory, Lawler had, quote, hired Abdullah to destroy his enemies. Abby was suspended after the match for attacking referee Jerry Calhoun. And then Lawler had thrown fire at Bob Armstrong, who vowed to his revenge as soon as his bandages come off.
Wow, okay. We've got some good stories going on over here on the Jarrett side.
We do. Kind of an interesting side fact on this is I looked at the posters for the cards in Louisville and Evansville during this time frame. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the cards through April, they still say that they're Gulas cards in Louisville and Evansville. And it's all Jarrett talent. And Jarrett had said that was in my name. I think they probably just had a poster for a template.
That's what I was going to ask you. You think it was just a template laying around until they got it changed?
And I think, hey, it's going to cost us some money to change this template. Let's just keep it how it is. All right. Now we get into the second big card at the Mid-South Coliseum for Nick Gulas.
Air quotes, big
March
card.
28th. Attendance is down to 1,599 people.
Wow.
So he's dropped several hundred people.
Yeah.
In the opening match, a 57-year-old Al Costello wrestles into a draw with Jerry Barber.
He couldn't even beat Jerry Barber.
Yes.
Got a kangaroo out and you can't just put him over.
The Russian Stomper is back. He had left Gulas where he'd been on top. He'd gone to Memphis for a brief period. He'd gone to Indianapolis. I think he may have even shown up in North Carolina. He could not find steady job at this point. No. But Gulas brings him back. He defeats Wayne Petty. Tojo Yamamoto and George Gulas defeat the Boston Strangler and Don Bass. So the fact that we have the Strangler teaming with Don Bass probably means that that's our good friend Mickey Poole.
Double doinks, man.
Luke Graham is a new man into the territory. He defeats Big Red.
Awesome.
Yeah. Tojo Yamamoto won a, quote, elimination match, which kind of sounds like a
Battle Royal.
Mm-hmm. And the Bounty Hunters are actually on top here, defeating Danny Little Bear and Chief Thundercloud. Okay. So any thoughts on Luke Graham? Do you have much background on him?
Boy, let me tell you, Luke Graham so the footage when he supposedly was in his prime, and I've heard from people that were watching when he was in his prime. Now that would be in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s. He was one of the first tag team champions in the WWF. He was really good, apparently, at that point in time. However, I really don't encourage anybody, but if you really want to know how bad Luke Graham was by this point, all you have to do is queue up the Peacock or the WWE Network or whatever the hell you have those old All-Star episodes on from the late 70s, Luke Graham's last run in New York. Watch that. Easily the worst wrestling from a wrestler in the New York territory, or any real territory that I've ever seen, that somehow he kept a job. Like, one of those matches should have gotten him fired. I mean, it's just the most atrocious stuff I've ever seen. And I'm not trying to knock him for when he was in his prime and apparently a really good heel during that little period there. I think he played a part maybe in Gorilla's babyface turn, if I'm not mistaken. But
okay.
But going back and watching the late 70s stuff, All-Star Wrestling on the network there for the WWF, the old B show. Check it out, guys. I encourage you to watch at least one, if not more. I mean, talk about the drizzling shits. It didn't get any worse. He would wrestle another decade beyond this too, Steve. So, I mean, just think about that.
Yes. Yeah, I have in my notes that he started in the early 60s, and he was largely inactive in 1976, and he was one of the guys that came from Detroit to work for Gulas. And as we go further, we will see him going to the top of the card for several months for Nick Gulas.
Name value-wise, I get it. I mean, what else do you have here at this point, right? But, I mean, just like I said, go watch. I don't know. Somebody owed him a favor or something for him to have worked as long as he did that last run in New York, which is probably around this time, maybe 78 or something like that. But it's just like, why? Why is he here? And why is he on every fucking week? It just, it was awful. Just awful. Worst stuff I've ever seen. They say Ox Baker got fired after one TV taping in 1980 in the WWF for being awful. And it's like, there's no freaking way. I know how Ox worked, and he still could have been worse than what I was watching there with Luke Graham, so I don't know.
Right. The Ox Baker, Roddy Piper stories of,
yes.
Well, sorry, thanks. We thought it would work out. All right, I do have one show in Louisville that's just kind of interesting. We talked in the first program about how when they did the heel turn of Pork Chop Cash against Gorgeous George, how Lawler did most of the interview
and
really ran down Gorgeous George, and George comes back and he's doing the weepy, I love my father, he was a great man routine. Mm-hmm. Well, they actually did a series of main events in Louisville. So they never put George on top in Memphis, but this was a strap match this night, 329 in Louisville. Okay. And I think there was like 3 or 4 weeks that he was on top there. So it's interesting that long interview, when I first saw it, I thought that's really weird. Lawler's doing all the talking because Pork Chop Cash was the former tag team partner, but they immediately put Wagner over Cash in Memphis. Forget about that. And this was really taped for the program in Louisville. So I thought that was interesting.
So they split Pork Chop Cash up from Gorgeous George Jr., and so you have to acknowledge the fact that they were a team and they split, but really it was all to get to Lawler and Gorgeous George on the B shows.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. There we go. All right. And now we have a legend we haven't talked about much this year. Okay. Maybe the legend. Returning to Nashville, Tennessee on March 30th. So let's talk about this card. Bounty Hunters once again in the opening match, defeating Ricky Fields and Jerry Barber. The Executioner moving down the card beats Buddy Diamond. The Samoans defeat Danny Little Bear and Chief Thundercloud, who are kind of doing a lot of jobs at this point. Tojo Yamamoto defeated Mickey Poole. He's wrestling without a mask on. And the fabulous one, Jackie Fargo, defeats Who is it? Who's this big foe for his first return match in Nashville for the year?
Tell us, Steve.
The Black Inferno.
Welcome back, Jackie Fargo.
Welcome back. We can bump the house by having him beat anybody. Let's find somebody in the crowd, put a mask on him, and have him win.
There you go.
And a loser-leave town match. Ken Lucas defeated Eddie Sullivan. Eddie's time with Gulas was a pretty short run at this.
Back to Alabama, point. Eddie. There you go.
Yeah, back to the Gulf Coast. So this was the first Nashville appearance of the year for Jackie Fargo. He was 46 years old. He'd been wrestling since 1950. And there's the only tape that I know from that year that I can find from the Gulas territory. If you look it up on YouTube, It's called Nick Gulas Interviews Jackie Fargo and Ken Lucas. And they're promoting a Chattanooga show. And Jackie says, "It's a pleasure to be back. I'm ready. I'm in there to get him. I don't even know who I'm wrestling." So he's promoting the show. I'm saying, "I'm going to show up and fight somebody. I don't know." He had talked. He does this kayfabe interview. He'd been wrestling a few times a week in the Carolinas or Virginia or somewhere to stay in good shape, and he was ready to go. But this is, a positive for the Gulas side that he gets one of the biggest legends in Tennessee wrestling history back on his side at this point.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. So Jackie Fargo's back. I mean, Nick Gulas had to make a few phone calls after being basically buried on the Memphis side of things, and now Jackie Fargo's back, it would appear. So that's a pretty cool way to end the month of March.
Yeah, one more note on the month of March. The average gate that we have where they've reported figures for the 3 Jarrett shows in Memphis, 8,674.
Wow.
So he's still doing tremendously well.
Even moving venues and moving the full-time date of his shows, and he's still succeeding at this point. I mean, that's some pretty good numbers.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the story that Paul Bosch told to Dave Meltzer. And he said, the reason the show didn't draw, I'm going to tell you like 10 reasons the show didn't draw. There was bad weather. There was a fair in town. People didn't have money at the end of the month. And he gave them all these excuses. And he said, and none of those mean anything, because if people really want to come to the show, they're going to come to the show.
That's it. Yeah.
And so, you had Jerry Jarrett writing really good television that people were interested in. You had major stars, and people came to the show.
And Nick Gulas drawing 1,600 people, no TV at this point over in the Memphis side of things, and half of his roster appears to be coming down from Detroit at this point in time, just to give you an idea.
Correct.
But we did have a Big Red sighting, and I don't want to overlook that. Big Red was popping into town there for Nick Gulas, so that's always fun to see.
Yeah,
Big Red in town against Luke Graham. I don't know how that went down, but a youthful Big Red, I should add.
That had to be a classic. If there were only video, the lucky people who saw that match, my goodness.
Oh man! So the war has started, and it looks like we should be shamed into calling it a war. Everybody's going to get us for false advertising when we put this show. What are you talking about a war? This doesn't sound like much of a war to me. So we conclude the month of March, and I know we're going to get into April next time, and so many big things coming still. Paul Orndorff on the horizon, lots of things to get into. But as we wrap this episode up, you do have a little note here. I wanted to touch on it now, because I'm going to try to ask Bob about it before we go back and record our next session. Now, Bill Dundee is working right now in Tennessee. However, he's going to do a couple dates you have here in these notes in April over in the San Francisco territory. He's going to be there for about a few days, it appears. And I think I remember asking Bob Roop about this, because this was exactly at the point in time where they switched bookers from Pat Patterson to Bob Roop over there in the territory. And I remember asking Bob about Dundee being over there for like just a cup of coffee. And Bob remembered seeing Bill there, but he didn't remember why he left. So I'm going to ask Bob again. Maybe he recalls, maybe I don't remember everything he told me about it. But I do know when I talked to him last time about it, this wasn't a case of switching bookers. So, you're switching talent. Bob had nothing against Bill Dundee. So I'm curious to see if that was Bill making a flight back from Australia or something. I have no idea, but I'll do a little digging in that.
Yeah, the best I can tell, it was probably a working vacation or something, but it was just completely weird. And I have seen the actual physical cards, which showed Dundee on the card and Bob Roop on the same card. Bob Roop's like headlining at that point. So yeah, that was just very bizarre. I never knew that until I was researching this year.
No, that was a good
But
catch.
the war is not completely over. but we have a very, very damaged opponent at this point in time. It's over for all intents and purposes.
Standing 9 count.
But Gulas is going to come back to Memphis a few more times, and we'll talk about that next time. And you want to talk about the law of diminishing returns. He learned that lesson really well.
Yeah, so we'll get into the month of April 1977 next time. And can Nick get any worse than 1,600 fans in the Mid-South Coliseum? We'll have to wait and see. Lance Russell and Davy Brown headed to WMC Channel 5, and so much more to get into next time. Steve, another blast. I love going through the commercial appeal with you. The great historical wrestling, newsworthy notes in the actual newspaper of the time. That's unbelievable. They're treating it as a real business. Imagine that.
Well, and it's amazing how many people he reached out to for that main article. I mean, the reporter certainly wanted to let you know, man, I put a lot of work into this. I talked to 10 different people, and I'm going to squeeze everything I can into this article. I thought I was reading a small book at one point because it took up a lot of space that day in the paper. But that, again, shows you how much interest there was in the product at the time.
Except for if you ask their old channel, the station managers of it. Right. There was the interest is just waning, so we had to let it go. And special thanks to Kevin Jones or whatever that young fellow's name was back in 77 for making that call that we need Lance Russell on our TV screen, because I think they're going to get it done. But we'll talk about that next time out and so much more. I want to thank you again, Steve, for doing this. Couldn't do it with anybody else do this. I love picking this one apart. The split of 77 in the Tennessee Territory. Jarrett leaving town, moving away from Nick Gulas and company and forming his own promotion. Jarrett Promotions, as we'll see moving forward. It's going to be a great time, great story upcoming in the month of April. But Steve, thank you so much for joining us once again here.
We're on a great ride. It's just going to continue to get interesting with more twists and turns.